If you've been planning for a while, then you've likely come across table-based trackers, or you might actually be using one without realizing it. But honestly, these are one of the most helpful styles of trackers that you can use in your journal. This is for two main reasons. One being that it's easier to capture a set of repeated steps easily and quickly, and two, being able to identify trends or patterns in the data collected. But first, what are table-based trackers? Just like you may have learned at school, a table involves vertical segments, called columns, and horizontal segments, called rows. Combining these rows and columns, we end up with a grid pattern. While the grid pattern is all good and well, what makes this a table is the meaning we assign to each of those columns and rows. Taking a look at a basic example, this here is a habit tracker, where each column represents a different habit that's being tracked, and each row represents a day of the month. These make the grid of the table, where the habit completion can be recorded for the month as a whole. Effectively, this gives us a habits versus date table tracker. Another example related to date would be a weekly habit tracker table. Again, we have the habits versus the date, but we've just switched which side they're on. So we've got the habits running down the side here, so a different row for each of the habits, and then the initials of the days of the week are along the top, giving us a column for each of those days. So this table again is habits versus date, but this time it's a day of the week rather than of the month. A less commonly considered example related to date would be a weekly schedule or a time log. This one's a weekly schedule. So you can see each of our columns is a day of the week, and then each of the rows is a different time. So it's still a table-based tracker, but rather than habits versus date, it's date versus time. Once you've got the table set up, you can then populate it with the going-ons for the week. All of these examples are powerful because of how it makes the information easier to record, and the additional information that they can give at a glance. On a table-based tracker, you only have to record each of your habits, or what they are, once. Whereas if you were trying to do this on a daily log, say, you'd have to write each of these things out every single day, which is not only time-consuming, having to write them all out, but also uses up a lot more space. So the table-based tracker is an excellent time saver and a space saver. Similarly, because you end up with a table view at the end of the period, whether that's a week or a month or whatever else, you also have a really good visual of what was going on for that period. We can see here that there are certainly some habits that I struggled with in the month, for instance, water intake, and there are others that I was pretty good at, like finishing work by 7 o'clock. Having this overview of my completion for the month makes it much easier to identify those patterns. In terms of something like a time tracker or a time log, which can also be set up as a table-based tracker, we can start to see patterns regarding when I do things in particular, or when I'm inclined to do things in particular. This can help me do things like structuring my day in ways that lean in to what I typically do, rather than fighting against it, and also helps me get a better perspective on how long things actually take. While those are all time-based examples, what about non-time-related table-based trackers? My favourite example of those are trackers that are used to monitor a series of projects that all have the same steps, or similar steps. The table we have here is a project versus task table tracker, where I write the project titles along the top, and in this case they're video titles, and then I have the steps to take to make each of those videos along the side. As I complete tasks, I can just cross them off, and if there are any projects that don't require a specific task, for instance, scripting for some of these videos wasn't necessary, I can just put a little dot to say, hey, don't need to do it for that project in particular. Again, it still saves me time because I don't have to write out every single one of these steps for every single one of these projects. Another example of this one is when it came to organizing materials for lessons. We have the lesson titles written out down the side here, and then each of the steps that I needed to do to prepare my materials for those lessons along the top. Like we said, the benefit with table-based tracking in this instance is that it's a time saver. Rather than having to write out each and every single one of these steps for each and every single one of these projects, or lessons, which would also take up quite a bit of space in my journal, I've got it all summarized in this table instead. We also again have the benefit of the visual aspect too. I can see at a glance how much progress I've made on these projects. Which steps do I still have to do for each of them? And if you list out all of these tasks in the order that you kind of want to do them, it almost makes this kind of like a progress bar. These are just some examples of table-based trackers, and I'd love to hear about how you've used tables in your journal. We've seen how the tables can be really helpful for habit tracking in particular, but if you are looking for some different layouts for your habit tracking, then this video is for you. Click or tap on that one and I'll see you over there.